Very much, Rachel. Thanks for that compliment. Yes, we've been through a tough time. Well, just a quick overview. The Approved Employers of Australia was formed because we realized with all the changes that were in place that the very people that employ the workers have got no say. So we formed the association to be really a lobby group, to communicate and to lobby, and then to make sure that we can use our experience and knowledge to assist approved employers to get through some of the challenges. Now, just for a lot of you that don't know, during COVID, we managed to, through different rules and regulations in different states and territories, we brought in a record number of workers. Why? Because we all collaborated and we all communicated. But our journey has still got a long way to go, and I must be honest, we've still got challenges. So I just want to go through a few things. We'll talk about labour mobility, trends and future options. We'll talk about risk mitigation strategies. We'll look at the new palm deed and guidelines. I'll talk about the ag visa because that's a bit of it's not an appropriate word according to the new government. And then any other question and answer that anybody may have. But let's just get on to a couple of things that I just want to point out. We all want a reliable, productive workforce that come back every year. I think that's a known. The problem is, how do we achieve that? Now, and I think we must get very clear in our minds, the days are over where we can just say we need 200 backpackers or whatever, working holiday makers. Those days are over. The rules have changed, and we've got to do a lot more planning and strategic thinking about our labour and how we're going to treat our labour. So, to my mind, it's about you've got to be very clear in your business, whether it's low-skilled, semi-skilled, or high-skilled workers, because I'll show you a bit later, there's some visa categories there that you need to consider to look at those different skill sets. But before COVID, we had over 200,000 what they call working holiday makers. They all went back, most of them went back, and until the borders opened again. So we all expected the floodgates to open. Didn't happen. So at the moment, during COVID, we had about 30,000 working holiday makers left. And that started the whole crisis. And that's where everybody started well, not everybody, but a lot of people moved towards what we call the PALM scheme. So since the borders opened, we have about it's close to 24,000 PALM workers in the country. So those are the 10 countries from the Pacific that come into Australia through quite challenging circumstances. But since then, as you can see, a lot of the visas have been issued, but the key issue here is that there's a lot of people with visas that can come back to the country, and the question is why they're not coming back in their droves. We're not sure, but if you look at where we're at the moment, currently there's 40,000 working holiday makers in Australia. This has increased 9,000 since May, which is a 94% increase since December. We have 2,000 to 3,000 visas being issued every week, but that is offshore. So it doesn't mean to say that although the visas have issued, they've actually arrived. And I think as of 19th of June, that's the most recent stats I got from Home Affairs, is for 52,000 working holiday makers in Australia. Point being, they're starting to come back. But the other thing I wanted to just demonstrate is in terms of skilled visas, there's about 52,400 skilled visas in the country, but the horticulture sector has only taken up 4%, which is about just over 2,000 workers. So we don't have many options going forward in terms of labour and recruitment of labour. So let's talk about, okay, so now we were on a projection. So the PALM scheme has got two legs to it. The one is short-term, which is 9 months, which the government wants to change to 11 months, that they're in the country, and then they've got to go home for a mandatory period of 3 months. Then you've got the long-term scheme, which is they are appointed on a full-time basis. They have for 3 to 4 years. They've just changed it to 4 years. They've also now allowed a visa to be issued, the 403, for a 4-year period, so short-term and long-term workers can come backwards and forwards. But now that we've got a new government, the PALM scheme was going to combine and be one scheme and was going to be run by DFAT. With the new government, they've changed that. It's now they've now created a new department, Okay, DEWA, Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. So now we're going to have 3 departments managing the palm scheme. This is going to be very interesting. So if you look at the current situation, and this is the point I want to make very clear to all the growers that are here today. Although there are 24,000 palm workers in the country, 2/3 of those work in horticulture. The next highest one is the meat industry that employ them. But they're expanding the scheme to other sectors, which is hospitality, aged care, etc. What that means is that that's going to put huge pressure on horticulture, because I can assure you, they're going to want to go into hospitality or aged care or any of those sectors, but not horticulture. I mean, why go and pick and slog it out when you can go somewhere else? So, and they want to be in the cities. So that's another issue that we need to really take into consideration. So we really need, besides the palm scheme, because the government has made it very clear that they want to support the Pacific, and we know why, but we do need an alternative source in horticulture, particularly, of labor, and that's where the Asian side of it comes in. Now, I'll talk about that shortly, but I think if you look at the new government and what they've said, they want to reduce administration and regulation. Well, that's going to be really interesting. So just so that you all know, we've just formed a red tape committee to talk about red tape, which is, it's quite interesting. So what is their definition of red tape and our definition is a little bit different. So they want to improve the industry and they want to engage with the industry. Now, how that's going to work, so I wrote a letter on behalf of our association to a whole lot of ministers, including Minister Wong. That was, I think, 3 weeks ago, addressing their commitments during the election and highlighting some of the issues. I have not received one email back in the process. So it just shows you they're waiting for direction and leadership with this palm scheme. We also have a meeting on Friday to discuss the so-called ag visa. I think I know what that's going to be, a very short discussion, because they do not actually want to entertain that. But what I'm appealing to the growers and the industry bodies here is we need to start uniting, to start pushing for an alternative visa scheme, because the palm scheme is aid-driven. Asia is not an aid country, so we need to look at that. We can support the palm scheme fully, but we need an alternative source of labor because we're going to run out. If you just listen to all the speakers that spoke this morning, we all spoke about labor and staff. That was a key message, and that's where our challenge lies, because without them, we can't harvest, and we don't have the people to do this. The other reason why I wanted to highlight why we need an alternative source of labor is because the palm scheme, the 10 Pacific countries, if you really analyze those countries, they do not have the population to actually supply the labor. They are struggling. Vanuatu, Samoa, and Tonga in particular have made it very clear that they've got a brain drain because all their professionals are coming to work in Australia. That's causing havoc in their own country. So to think we're just going to expand the palm scheme just like that is not going to happen. The other thing is that you as a grower need to take responsibility for the workers, because with the piece rate and an increase in wages, the selection and recruitment and education of workers, wherever we get them from, is becoming more and more critical. We really need to make sure that we get that right. So, let's just look at a bit of a split between how that, so we've got 33% of the workers are from the PLS, which is the long-term stream, and 67% is the SWP, which is the 9-month period. We're going to have to think a lot more smarter about how we collaborate and how we can, and talk about labor mobility a lot more, because there's a lot of growers, particularly in your industry, that have short-term periods where they require labor, and then there's other industries that can take them for a longer period of time. We need to think how we can balance the short and the long-term workforce that we have on the ground. But if you look at the numbers there, Queensland by far 37% is the highest user of labor from the Pacific, whereas New South Wales and Vic are pretty similar, 17%, and then the rest follow. Now, if you look at risk mitigation strategies, so let's look at what our options are. A, we can employ locals. Yes, we all try very hard to do that. We need to go through some serious hoops by labor market testing. Are they actually applying for the job, or are they just ticking the box to get their dole? You know, I asked the question. So, and if you look at, when we had a seminar in April in Canberra where they spoke about the US program, the Canadian program, and New Zealand and Australia. They all have the same issues with labor. They cannot get the labor now. Here, Mexico is running out of labor. Peru is running out of labor because the demand is so strong. Even Europe getting labor from Africa, etc. So we're all sitting in a similar boat. We're not unique in the situation. But how do we place ourselves strategically? So, okay, then you've got the PALM scheme, which is, again, as I mentioned, short-term, and then long-term employment. Then you've got the working holiday makers that are starting to trickle back. And then we've got what we call the ag visa, which is a big question mark, or an alternative visa stream. And I'll come back to why we need to push this alternative visa stream. But in terms of PALM, you have a financial risk because you've got to pay a lot of the costs up front. You've got huge pastoral care responsibilities to look after your labor. The administrative burden on that and the cost to business, and I was just speaking to Richard earlier, he's got over 200 workers, and the number of people that he has to employ to look after them is quite a big ratio. So he's talking about 1 to 60, one person for every 60 workers to look after them, and that's a huge cost to business. And I think the other thing is, very importantly, is that in the Pacific, you're very prone to cyclones and natural disasters like happened in Tonga, where they had that tsunami. So if you've planned all your stuff and you're getting all your labor from one country or one Pacific country, that's a very high risk. So how do we mitigate that risk? I think we need to have a combination. And speaking to one employer, they look at a bit of a ratio. So come back to what do you actually want in your labor force, low skilled, semi-skilled, and skilled labor, and look at the different visa categories and how you can maximize that to actually source the labor you require. It's not an easy process, and I go back to what I said earlier, planning, and not just 2 months in advance. I'm talking 3 to 6 months in advance. Those days are over of just getting labor at the whim. So you need to look at a combination of what is available and what are you prepared to invest in those different schemes. But the one that's the most onerous is the PALM scheme, no doubt. But for those that have used it, there's a percentage, yes, we will acknowledge, that have done the wrong thing, but largely and importantly, they're consistent, they return to work, and they're productive. So, and then again, you look at the benefits of what they've given back to their own countries, it's quite immense. So we've got to remember all the good things as well, not just the bad. Right, so if you look at the various, I'm just listing these visa categories here, and they've got a copy of the presentation, but there are different visa categories that you need to go and investigate to see how you can maximize them. Those are the key ones. And I think that's very important because depending on the skill sets that you require, you need to look at how you can tap into these. And you need the expertise to see how they work and what your requirements are. It's not that easy. So, so those are the various visa categories. Now, if you look at, I want to come back to the planning side of it. So while the PALM scheme is waiting for direction from the government, we're in a bit of a state of flux because nobody can really make decisions. So when I say I've got timelines there, I'm not going to go through that because of time constraints. But they've got guidelines. Let me assure you, those guidelines there are not the worth of the paper they're written on because it's going to take double the time. So if they say to you it takes 3 months, add 6 months in your planning because there's all sorts of hurdles along the way that you need to get through. There they're talking here from the time you apply. So you first apply and then you've got to get that over the line. And I separate the two. Is where you actually apply to become an approved employer, get that out the way. Because once you become an approved employer, then the recruitment and selection process starts, which is another discussion. So they're talking about becoming an approved employer up to 12 weeks. I reckon it's 6 months. Okay? Just remember that. Then there's also, one of the biggest things about the application is your financial situation. They hammer on about that. And whether you've got any issues with fair work, so they do a due diligence on you second to none. So if you've got any skeletons in the closet, be careful, okay, because they'll pull them out. But there are checklists. There's a checklist for when you do your application, and then there's also a recruitment checklist. Those are critical to any of the processes that you go through to make sure you got it all there. Otherwise, you end up going backwards and forwards, and the government love going backwards and forwards. They love just sending things back so that you can go, and they wait. This all takes time. Try and get it right first time, because that's the key. Right, then the recruitment and selection process, and I can't emphasize this more. There's a couple of things here that I just want to mention. If you're going to go the PALM scheme route, your relationship with the Pacific becomes critical. You've got to go meet them. You've got to go there, sit with them, tell them what you actually want. What are your requirements? You cannot leave it up to the sending country to decide what labor you require for your business. You must decide that. You must look at the character. You must look at the skill sets. Then people say, what country do I source from? Well, what car do you want to drive? What car do you want to drive in Brisbane or off-road? It depends on your requirements, and you've got to be clear on that. You've got to communicate to those people. And again, I come back to the increase in wages. Recruitment, selection, education becomes key. Right, so when you do, the other thing is now that we need to do as approved employers is apply for the visas, and that's a bit of a tricky one. So you've got to get the medical checks done, you first got to pay for your visa, and then they may fail the visa, and then you've lost $325. So where do you get that back from? So you've got to, so these processes are very critical. If you've got a good relationship with the LSU or the senior country, that helps a lot. And then you're going through, you get all your medicals, police checks, and then the worker mobilization, which again, the education part of it, we as Australians think they know everything. Just remember, these people come from very remote areas. They don't know what to expect. And a lot of them have just been jammed on a plane, and they get here, and then the problems start. So you just got to make sure you educate these people before they even leave their country. This is the recruitment checklist, which I'm not going to go through, but okay. I want to go back to the ag visa that we had. So we had a small working group that was going to launch a pilot. They were in discussion with 4 Asian countries, and then Vietnam signed just on the 28th of March, just before we went into caretaker mode. So we're still uncertain what they're going to do, but we had worked out all the settings, the whole pathway. We had a 700 worker cap to start, work through the process, and then we're going to open it up. That's now all on hold. Now we're here, they want to put the whole old ag visa concept into PALM scheme. We're not in favor of that because we want a separate scheme that is separate from an aid scheme. So again, we're urging all industry associations and growers to push hard on having an alternative scheme because we need that labor. We estimate that horticulture alone needs at least 10,000 workers plus. So I just want to go back to some of the key challenges, whatever we're going to do with labor. It's the cost and the risk. Now, accommodation. I find it hilarious that they've made the commitment that the Pacific can bring their families over. Where are they going to stay? We've got a major crisis with accommodation. And I can assure all the growers sitting here that if you want to, no matter which way you go, you need to have accommodation secured in some shape or form, because accommodation and transport are the critical things. It's very hard to come by. Supply, the demand far outstrips supply. So we've got a major issue. I think the other key issue is that to look after the welfare and well-being of workers, those that are here that do it know what I'm talking about. You cannot just pull somebody off the street and say, look after these workers. You really got to train those people, and they've got to know what they're doing. I think the administration and burden costs, you've got to really look at that, because that is a cost to business. Again, I want to emphasize recruitment, selection, education, your responsibility. Then where to source the labor from? Well, speak to me offline, and then, because if I understand what your needs are, I think I can steer you in the right direction, but it's not easy because it depends on what you actually want done, okay, and what the nature of the job is. So to pick oranges is very different to pick strawberries, so you need a different skill set or different type of person coming in. Timelines, again, make sure that you plan in advance. Labour planning now is critical. It must be strategically part of your business. Then cultural understanding. We expect them to just fit in with the Aussie way of life, but we can be doing things. And I think I was having chats to one of the AEs today to say they had a meeting with one of the labour sending units, agreed to all the things, and a couple of hours later they said, no, we're not agreeing to that, we're not agreeing to that. Something has gone amiss culturally, and we bring the people here, we can be doing things that they culturally are sensitive to. But lastly, I want to go back to all this talks about ethical trading and all that kind of stuff. Nobody's doing anything about all the illegal operators. And I question why that's not being addressed, where we sitting here are all trying to do the same thing. So thank you very much.